Be it resolved that this House support, promote, and facilitate the Assembly's efforts to increase the productive capacity and improve the quality of infrastructural development on the island. And be it further resolved that this House urge all sectors of the Tobago population to collaborate in a process that would facilitate structural and systematic transformation, improve the island's competitiveness, and enhance the achievement of sustainable economic, environmental, and social development. This motion brings into sharper focus the fact that if we are to continue to enjoy the standard and the quality of life and prosperity that we now have, our development must take place in an accelerated and sustainable manner. Because, Mr. Presiding Officer, development is a journey. It is not a destination. And that was the mantra of this administration when we came into office in 2001, developing Tobago, developing Tobagoanians in a developing Tobago. And a definition for development is that economic development is referred to as the quantitative and qualitative changes in an existing economy. It also involves development of human capital, increasing the literacy ratio, improving important infrastructure, improving health and safety, and other areas that aim at increasing the general welfare of citizens. A Nobel laureate in economics defines it as freedom is the primary goal of development. He says that freedom is also the principal means of development, and development is the process of expanding human freedom. And it also means the removal of major sources of lack of freedoms, such as poverty, all types of neglect, and the lack of economic activity, and so on. Mr. Presiding Officer, there is also widespread agreement and based on overwhelming empirical evidence that the quality of human capital, infrastructure, and institutional development are the three most important preconditions for sustained economic growth and transformation for developing countries. And while a country's natural resource endowment is also very important, and maximizing the impact of natural resources and ensuring that these resources are used to ensure long-term economic sustainability depends on the availability and quality of the three factors that I mentioned earlier. And this is, in fact, a clear challenge facing us not only in Tobago, Mr. Presiding Officer, but facing us as a nation. And that is why, as I said before, this motion is so timely and this motion is important. Mr. Presiding Officer, this motion is timely because we are now at the midpoint in the implementation of the Comprehensive Economic Development Plan for Tobago, CDP 2.0. And the time is opportune for us to stop, to reflect, and to analyze on the current state of this island's development and to look at the strides that we would have made.
This motion is timely for a number of reasons. It is later at a time when we celebrate the completion of two of our largest infrastructural projects in Tobago, the Scarborough Library, which was opened on Sunday, and the already being used and soon to be officially opened Shore Park Cultural Complex. And these two projects, in the context of this motion, these two projects are projects that are not just edifices, they're not just buildings. These are projects that are aimed to transform the Tobago's human capital. And in all the debates that have been going about these projects, that has always been missed. The Scarborough Library is not a building, just a building. Neither is the Shore Park Cultural Complex. These are buildings put up to facilitate the development of Tobagonians in terms of educating our people at all ages, and in terms of developing sporting talent, cultural activity, development of cultural talents, and even for training, for which we can use both the library and Shore Park. And it is really about the way that this administration does business, in that it is what the PNM has been doing in Tobago since 2001. And of course, what we will continue to do, Mr. Presiding Officer, until 2017, when we ask the people again for our next mandate. Mr. Presiding Officer, enhancing Tobago's development has always taken precedence in the conscience and the actions of the Assembly, because of what it means in the context of us being able to remain relevant and competitive in today's rapidly changing environment. It is about securing a sustainable future and creating meaningful opportunities for our children, our stakeholders, and interest groups. There are those who in the past 4.5 years have tried to sort of take part of that mantle. And the thing is that, as the state saying goes, they are none so blind as those who cannot see. Because for anyone who looks at Tobago critically over the last 10 years or more, would see the type of development that we have brought as an assembly to Tobago. The visible physical transformation of Tobago continues to occur throughout the island, and it is linked to creating a better quality of life for our people and influencing them, in so doing, influencing them to reach for higher levels of personal development, personal and family attainment. In today's debate, I will discuss some of the adjustments and formidable efforts of the Assembly over the years to continue delivering to Tobago quality infrastructure and programs. And this has been done despite oftentimes unfavorable geopolitical and economic pressures, as would have been alluded to by the Secretary for Finance. And we are doing so in a manner where we ensure that value is received for our investment, and more so that the same infrastructure can serve the productive and efficient ends that to which they are intended. So really, when one looks at the achievements of the Assembly, you can see an unwavering commitment, not only the changing face of Tobago, but in terms of the functionality of Tobago, the functionality of our infrastructure, and can also be measured by the social advancement of our people. When the Secretary for Education speaks later on today, we would see the evolution of Tobago's people in terms of their educational development. And it is really because of that marriage between infrastructure and development and human development activities that Tobago has done as well as it's been doing in the past decade or more. So I want to agree with the motion. I want to congratulate the Executive Council for leading the effort and I'm talking about this Executive Council and past Executive Councils of this administration, in leading the effort in sustaining Tobago's social and economic development. Of course, to get the fullest aspect of our development, it requires a multilateral approach, and the Secretary would have alluded to that. We have to include the efforts of the private sector, civil groups, NGOs, and all kinds of different organizations to harness the dynamic capacities that we can get out of such partnerships. In other words, we must all come together to continue to develop Tobago. We must all play our part.
As the Secretary with responsibility for education, youth affairs, and sport, our division has a critical role in re-engineering, transforming, and preparing Tobagonians to ensure that this thing that talk about productive capacity and sustainable development and being able to compete and international competitiveness. That is a key role that we have. And Mr. Presiding Officer, what this administration then set about doing is, one, working with the NTA to identify the opportunities, the training opportunities that existed, so that we would have been in a position to allow Tobagonians, young and old, youth and youth of yesteryear, to know what were the training opportunities that existed, what were the requirements for the participation in those training opportunities, what were the certification at the end, if a stipend was being paid, and therefore position themselves to benefit from it. We then, in conjunction, and stealing a little thunder from the Secretary of Labor, we then undertook, Mr. Presiding Officer, to a series of labor market surveys every 6 months, so that we would have been able to provide, again, persons with information on where the jobs that were available now, what were the, and more importantly, what were the emerging jobs in the months and the years ahead, so that as a young Tobagonian who was an adult looking to change careers, you would have an idea of what were the current jobs, what were the jobs that were going to be available in the future. And therefore, Mr. Presiding Officer, position yourself to make use of those opportunities. But Mr. Presiding Officer, we went further to that. We then began, in conjunction with the National Training Agency and a number of other agencies, a series of career fairs that allowed Tobagonians, young and so young, the opportunity to interface and interact with employers, training providers, and get a sense of what were the requirements, what were the jobs that they had available within their organizations, what were the jobs, I apologize, what were the jobs that were available within those organizations, what were the requirements, both in terms of aptitude and aptitude that those employers were looking for. And we began that at career on an annual basis, Mr. President, and then that dovetailed, Mr. Presiding Officer, into a series of mini career fairs that were being hosted by the schools themselves. Mr. Presiding Officer, so that then allowed Tobagonians to get a sense of how they could better themselves and re-engineer themselves and be better prepared for the global marketplace and even, of course, the regional. Mr. Presiding Officer, this administration then took the bold step and worked with the National Training Agency to ensure that the TTNVQ, now known as the CVQ program, Caribbean Vocational Qualification, a program that was new to Trinidad and Tobago, but that was for years in place in Jamaica and Scotland and Germany, this VQ process, that allowed a person, Presiding Officer, to start to be trained and assessed, whether it's in bread, cake, and pastry making, whether it's in office procedures, office administration, whether it's masonry, and start with a basic qualification, Unit 1. Because the purpose of that vocational qualification, Mr. Presiding Officer, was to ensure that persons were assessed fairly, that they were given a qualification that will allow them to be recognized for what they can do. It was also a qualification that was portable, and therefore that they could leave here and go to Jamaica or go to Germany, and starting off as a laborer in Trinidad and Tobago, the Unit 1, and then maybe ending up with your master's degree in masonry and a master craftsman, Mr. Presiding Officer, at Unit 25 or 26. That was a bold step taken by this administration and this Tobago Assembly in partnership with a number of agencies, Mr. President, to ensure that we made sure our Tobagonian, our people, were globally competitive. Mr. Presiding Officer, within the Division of Education, we set about transforming our school plans, and over the years, we spent tens of millions of dollars on ensuring that our schools were comfortable. Mr. Presiding Officer, and therefore our children could learn better, our teachers could perform and operate more effectively, therefore, and therefore make the environment more child-friendly and more conducive to learning and working, Mr. Presiding Officer. But Mr. Presiding Officer, not only did we make the existing school plans more comfortable, we sought about, in conjunction, of course, with the central government, to build 3 new schools, which 10 years later, because all 3 of them 10 years later, have made a milestone that they have become successful schools in their own right, in the name, of course, of Goodwood High School, Speyside High School, and Mason Hall Government Secondary. And Mr. Presiding Officer, I want to hack in our minds that there were people who wanted to know if we go crazy to go and build a school in Speyside. Now, Speyside is a school of choice. It is, and I say that again, there were people say, well, go and build a school in the sea, go wash away. That will make no sense, we'll be in high school. That now, Mr. Presiding Officer, 10 years later, the Manta Rays is the school of choice. It is succeeding academically, in sport, in visual art, in performing arts, and in all areas, Mr. Presiding Officer. It has become a school of choice. And Mr. Presiding Officer, that is because this administration set up a deliberate strategy to transform the education, knowing the critical role education, youth affairs, and sport plays in building productive capacity, in sustainable development, and ensuring that our people are competitive internationally.
The Division of Settlements and Labour will host a training workshop for the benefit of Tobago contractors in the area of, or in the areas of, finance management, project management, and human resource management. Because, Mr. Presiding Officer, I sincerely feel that once those contractors who suffer from mobilization syndrome walk into that 2-week program, they will walk back out with an appreciation for utilizing their mobilization fee for that which was intended. Because, Mr. Presiding Officer, we want our Tobago contractors to succeed. We want our Tobago contractors to get to a point where they can move from small to medium to large, so that they would be in a position to handle massive mega projects right here in Tobago, as opposed to us, most times, for mega projects, having to bring in the labor, having to import the labor, Mr. Presiding Officer. So we want our Tobago contractors to raise their game. We want our Tobago contractors to raise the bar. We want our Tobago contractors, Mr. Presiding Officer, we want their standard to improve. We want their level of productivity, efficiency, and professionalism to improve, Mr. Presiding Officer. And therefore, building the capacity of our Tobago contractors is of paramount importance to us. Mr. Presiding Officer, this administration has been in office, this Orville London administration has been in office since 2001, Mr. Presiding Officer. And from the advent of this administration, we have seen the challenges for finances in the field of infrastructural development, particularly for housing, Mr. Presiding Officer. Mr. Presiding Officer, we requested some $419 million for this fiscal for housing. We got 28, Mr. Presiding Officer. And that has been the trend from 2001 to present. They give us 10% or less than 10% for the development of housing in Tobago. Whereas over the seas, when you go down to Trinidad and you rent a car and you're driving down to go down to South or Enterprise, you see thousands of houses, Mr. Presiding Officer. Thousands, while we could only deliver 2 digits per annum. So we could only deliver sometimes 30 or 40 per annum. But in Trinidad, you see in a particular development, 1,500. In another development, you see 1,000, 1,200. In another one, you see 1,000, 1,400. In another, you see 2,500, Mr. Presiding Officer. And this Orville London-led administration has made it clear that Tobagonians must receive their just due, Mr. Presiding Officer. And time again, we continue to see in Tobago that Tobagonians are intelligent people, Mr. Presiding Officer. Tobagonians are people who are not easily fooled. Tobagonians are people who are not easily mama-guide. And we will not embrace being mama-guide, Mr. Presiding Officer. We have made efforts to bring in private partners to assist with developing estates that we have here in Tobago in an effort to have more units available to distribute to more Tobagonians. And I must say that that effort is in the very capable hands of EIDCOT, which is under the astute management of the Division of Finance and Enterprise Development, ably led by the Secretary of Finance and Enterprise Development, Assemblyman Joel Jack.
An economy is a lot stronger when the people residing in the country, when they are skilled and self-reliant. And therefore, we cannot afford to build an economy based on dependency, but we must ensure that our people here in Tobago in particular, for which we are responsible, are self-reliant and skilled people, Mr. Presiding Officer. And therefore, in my division, one of our major programs is the Vocational Skills Training Program. And that program, Mr. Presiding Officer, we had 294 participants in 2013. And last year, 2014, we saw an increase of more than 50%, where 453 persons participated. From as young as 15 years old, Mr. Presiding Officer, to as old as 74. And this year, based on reports, the people at my office, Mr. Presiding Officer, are actually overwhelmed because people are coming to the office on a regular basis to register and sign up for these programs. And therefore, this year we are actually focusing on the creative industries. And we have added a program in natural jewelry making. And you know, sometimes the members of the public tend to disagree when members of the assembly travel. But in a recent trip to Guadeloupe, we had first-hand experience where the people of Guadeloupe, in terms of their level of art and craft, were significantly higher than ours. And we saw where they were using natural material, even fish scales, bamboo in some cases, driftwood that you would find in the river. They were using these materials and transform them into jewelry, whether it's earrings, necklaces, jewelry, Mr. Presiding Officer, that can even rival what you would find in Caribbean jewelers. And these are the things, Mr. Presiding Officer, that tourists will come from all over the world and spend significant sums of money to acquire these kinds of jewelry. So therefore, we decided that this year we must have a program that will train our people to transform a lot of these materials that you will find all over Tobago into usable jewelry that people will actually purchase and wear. And therefore, that course was added to the Vocational Skills Training Program. Apart from that, Mr. Presiding Officer, we added Pre-C courses and boat master level 3 courses. And in this area, we are targeting the fishing villages. We are targeting specifically those guys who like to lime on the block. Because, Mr. Presiding Officer, if we are talking about our oil and gas resources, if we are talking about Tobago possibly going in the direction of, exploring our own oil and gas resources, then we have to talk as well about, you know, having our people skilled and positioned to seize some of the opportunities for employment that will come in these areas. And I think there are a number of issues if we're talking about building capacity and building our institutions here in Tobago, and we are talking about internal self-government, and we are talking about growth and development. There are a number of issues that we need to deal with in our public sector. Because we have issues where, for instance, gratuity and overtime payments, Mr. Presiding Officer, takes a tremendous amount of time. And there are numerous complaints. People come to me very often about not getting gratuity payments, sometimes for periods in excess of 5 years, and so forth. The timely payment of suppliers, Mr. Presiding Officer. Sometimes, due to waiting months for payment, you have some small businesses are actually reaching the point of closure right here in Tobago. The general level of customer service, Mr. Presiding Officer, is something that we seriously have to look at in the public sector. When the average Tobagonian walks into a government office, they must feel welcome, they must feel appreciated, they must feel respected, and they must feel like the issue or their concern is important.
Human capital development is important, and I think we have sounded that out quite convincingly today. And testament to that is close to 2,000 persons and more, but these 2,000 persons would have been supported through the National Assistance Unit, the Chief Secretary's office, to really have an opportunity to realize their dream of pursuing tertiary education. And it's important that I make mention of that, Mr. Presiding Officer, because I think I had the opportunity to benefit from that program, and I think many other young persons throughout Tobago would have benefited from that program, and it might have only been because of that program that would have given them and afforded them the opportunity to pursue tertiary education. And that is also testament in terms of our commitment to human capital development here on the island. Also, in terms of human capital development, Mr. Presiding Officer, we are aware of the gaps and the shortages. Yes, we can trumpet and we can talk about our successes, but we are well aware of the challenges in terms of youth unemployment, the need for further youth development, and as Assemblyman Answer Dennis would have alluded to a little while ago, and my colleague, Secretary of Education, Hewitt Cadet, that we are putting the plans and programs in train, and again, we are making a clarion call for young Tobagonians and not so young Tobagonians to make use of these opportunities. The point I was making is the issue with governance and development, and the need for us to advance to Tobago's development, and the need for representation, and the need for collaboration between the Executive Council and the Tobago House of Assembly and the central government, so that we can have our issues represented properly.
We chose the result of this House to urge all sectors of the Tobago population to collaborate in a process that will facilitate structural and systemic transformation, improve the island's competitiveness, and enhance the achievement of sustainable economic, environmental, and social development. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it.